Dairy is a huge part of New Zealand. It contributes massively to our economy, making up 25% of our exports. Agriculture's always been the backbone of the country, but the perception of dairy is changing.
I've come from a sheep and beef background, and as a sheep and beef farmer, everyone loved me, and as soon as I went dairy farming, the attitude was just different.
Dairy cows are one of the most polluting animals you can farm, and we've filled our country with them. The massive growth of dairy over the last 30 years has come with negative impacts on our environment. Excessive fertilisers on our paddocks, pollution of our rivers, and high emissions contributing to climate change.
We're not some massively evil group of people destroying New Zealand.
We certainly don't get it right all the time, but we're certainly heading in the right direction.
In this series, I investigate environmental issues down on the farm and seek solutions. Farmers are part of who we are as Kiwis, and so is the love of the environment we live in. These are big issues for all of us here in Aotearoa, in the land of milk and money. Growing up in rural Southland, I remember when this was nothing but sheep and beef farms. But over my lifetime, I experienced this dramatic transition to dairy. When I was born, there was only 40,000 dairy cows here, and now there's over 600,000. I really don't remember this cow on top of the tavern. To be fair, I don't really remember many cows around here growing up. But that dairy boom wasn't just here, it was all over the country. So when I became a journalist, I was really keen to understand why that was and what effect it was having. My family's part of the dairy industry, so I understand the economic reasons. I've benefited from them. But like everyone, I was also increasingly hearing about the environmental trade-off of that. Can dairy continue to support my family and many others without degrading the environment? In this 6-part doco-series, I'm going to try and find out. I grew up thinking of dairy as a glass of milk, but that's not really what the dairy industry's gotten rich from. So let's start by getting our heads around what the industry really does. The whole thing revolves around our 6.3 million dairy cows that we impregnate once a year to keep producing milk. When the calves are born, they're separated from their mothers and half are killed within days or weeks of being born.
It's not uncommon for it to be 500 or 700, depends on the size of the herd, across the calving period. I know a lot of people say that that is one of the hardest things that they've got to deal with.
Our cows produce milk most of the year, which is transported to processing factories across the country and turned into a variety of products. But most of what we make is some form of powdered milk.
Well, there's many ways that you can make money out of milk in an export play. You can take the water out of it and turn it into a powder. And we do an awful amount of that in New Zealand, and we do that really, really well.
In 2020, we made $20 billion from exporting dairy products. Dairy consumption worldwide is growing, and so is the pressure on our farmers to keep up with that demand.
Consumption of dairy products are continuing to grow 2 or 3% year upon year upon year.
To keep up with this demand, we've pushed our environment more and more to produce enough milk.
The industry is built on growth, and the government still talks about increasing milk production.
Fertiliser and feed allow us to have more cows than we could otherwise.
We don't exactly know how many cows we could sustain here, but it's a hell of a lot less than we have currently.
Our waterways are under serious threat from this fertiliser-heavy approach.
I think it's clear that we have an utter failure of freshwater management in New Zealand. All of the indicators we have is that things are bad and getting worse.
And most urgently, we're in the midst of a climate crisis and need to do our part in reducing global emissions.
We've got to accelerate at speed and scale the reduction of emissions, and there's going to be pain.
All of these factors have an environmental cost, and none of it's good. So why do we do it? In this episode, we're going to look at the money side of milk, what the environmental cost is, and whether it's all worth it. Agriculture's always played a major role in Aotearoa's economy. For almost 2 centuries, we pumped out meat and wool to the world. And up until the 70s, the Brits in particular would just buy it all up. In this period, half of our sheep farmers' income was subsidised by the government. Then from 1984, our Finance Minister Roger Douglas pulled these subsidies, telling New Zealand farmers to either sink or swim. One of the many changes that are still snidely referred to as Rogernomics. In the following 10 years, a lot of farmers sank, taking a heavy financial and emotional toll on our rural communities. the whole industry spent a decade trying to find an economic solution. By 1990, it became clear that dairy was where the money was, and so the dairy boom began. Now, over 30 years later, dairy makes up 3.5% of all the money circulating in New Zealand and represents a quarter of all the money we make from exports, bringing in over $20 billion in 2020. Consultant Peter Fraser calls himself a guerrilla economist. He worked for the Ministry of Agriculture as a policy advisor on the dairy industry, until he found his views on intensive dairy clashed with the status quo.
As an economist, I look back at our mode of development. Since European colonisation of New Zealand, first thing we did is we cashed in our seals, then we cashed in our whales, and then we cashed in our cowrie, and then we cashed in our gold. And if you look at what we're doing now, we're cashing in our water. We've been here before. This is not a mode of development that we want. It's not a mode of development that's right. I don't want to be in a position where I'm saying to my grandkids, I did nothing. We have a world where we treat the environment as a free good, and if we thought about it as a balance sheet, we're actually eating our balance sheet. This is ground zero. This is the kitchen table. So to borrow a phrase from Fonterra, it all starts here. Because this is where I've written, I don't know how many submissions, how many reports on the dairy industry. The growth of dairying really needs to be taken into context of the decline of the wool industry. From the late 19th century, almost through to the late 20th century, New Zealand's major export, our white gold of the time, was actually strong wool. Now, to pivot from the one form of white gold, the wool, to the other form of white gold, the milk, we had to do a lot of land use change. You've got to go and get rid of shearing sheds and put in milking sheds. The vast majority of that was debt funded. And from 2000 to 2015, the amount of dairy debt increased about threefold, from about 10 billion to around 30 billion. We had this hope that with the rise of international dairy prices, that the increased returns would pay the debt back. What actually happened between 2015 and 2020, we had a number of very, very bad dairy seasons. Farmers ended up borrowing a further 10 billion. We went from 30 to 14 billion, and now we're kind of stuck at 40. We've had about 3 good dairy seasons, yet the actual amount has barely moved.
Young Southland farmer Scott Mathieson optimistically returned to the family farm after 10 years living in Auckland. He had ambitions to make the most environmentally sustainable farm he could, but quickly discovered the financial challenges of this vision.
Back maybe 13 years now was quite a general conversion within Southland to large dairy farms, and that's when our farm expanded. We bought neighbouring properties and we became a large dairy farm. It's hard for us to understand now, looking at the current financial situation, how that looked like a good idea, taking on that much debt and assuming that that really elevated milk payout would stay at that price and not be affected by everything that happens. A lot of people went into these large-scale conversions and took on a lot of debt, and that's where we are now. Originally coming back, I had been urban and removed for so long that I had quite a romantic idea of rural living. I had a lot of ideas of how to pull back our herd numbers and to diversify so that that was possible. That was also very naive. So dairy, the model we have, is the only economic model where we can actually sustain and pay off the loans that we have to convert into this dairy system. Quite early on, understanding that that's how our farm functioned and we couldn't dramatically change anything for financial reasons. We need to stay with the model that we have, but hopefully make small tweaks to make it more sustainable. But it is still an intensive system where we require a lot of inputs, and the inputs are the damaging circumstance for New Zealand and for the environment, definitely.
The Mathiesons are one of the many farming families who converted in the last 30 years to meet the growing demand for dairy. Now, there are over 11,000 dairy farms across the country, with industry employing nearly 40,000 people across farming, transport and processing. There's a bunch of different markers of this growth. Like in the past 20 years, we've more than doubled the number of dairy cows to 6.3 million. We've increased the amount of land we use for dairy by 81%, all at the cost of an increase in dairy debt of 267%. But this major transition from sheep to dairy hasn't only cost us more money, it's also been far more taxing on our environment. Cows eat way more, so farmers have to use more chemical fertilisers. They poop and pee way more, so climate change intensifies, and our waterways and groundwater soak up the residue. It's polluted our rivers and streams, and even some of our drinking water.
I have definitely come to the understanding that a huge problem that we have is the intensification of agriculture within our current society. Our urban population, which is the majority and a huge percentage of our society, is very removed from where their food is coming from. So we do not have a relationship with someone on the land. We're not seeing who is growing our food. We don't know if it's even from our own country. What practices are used to produce that food, what chemicals like that, that's a huge problem.
Scott wants to explore regenerative farming, a growing movement that hopes to lessen these impacts by using fewer artificial inputs. He'd like to lower his cow numbers and maybe even milk once a day instead of twice, but old farm debt has made this difficult, and so is the industry itself.
If we could lower cow numbers, it would solve pretty much everything, but we can't. If we lower cow numbers by the number that we actually need to make the new system work, our milk production, the method in which we are paid, would drop, and we would not be able to maintain our loan.
Well, we've got a real problem with land use in New Zealand because we've converted land to dairying that should never ever have gone into dairying, and that's creating a whole bunch of environmental problems. And so I don't think in many areas that can be mitigated, so the cows are just going to have to go. So that means we are looking at, over the next 10 to 15 years, potentially a lower milk supply than what we have now. That has real problems for Fonterra, because it means they've got lots of factories chasing not very much milk. This is really tough stuff. This is difficult stuff. There are no easy answers here. What's driven the industry for the last 30, arguably even the last 100 years, has been an increasing milk supply. The problem is we're now at peak cow with no increase in the milk supply. Fonterra is very much circling the wagons and keeping the milk that it's got.
Fonterra is owned by the 10,000 farmers who provide it milk. Fonterra sets a price for this milk based on demand, ranging from around $4 per milk solid to $8 per milk solid in the last 10 years. As farmers' main source of income, this volatility in milk price means farmers' income can vary dramatically year to year. But as part owners in the business, Fonterra farmers also share in the profits when it has a good year. Fonterra was literally created by the government to be a giant in the industry and still control 81% of milk processing and are New Zealand's top earning company. That amount of control and resources means they're at the heart of any meaningful change the industry can make. So we're in Auckland to meet with Miles Hurrell, who's the CEO of Fonterra. So we've been looking at the industry as a whole, but really it all comes back to the decisions that businesses make, and Fonterra is New Zealand's biggest dairy business.
People talk about, why don't we remove cows out of the New Zealand society? Why don't we reduce the cow numbers in New Zealand? Consumption of dairy products are continuing to grow 2 or 3% year upon year upon year. So if you were to do that, that milk's still going to be produced elsewhere, and we're the lowest carbon producing milk in the world. And so from a New Zealand perspective, there's a challenge to say, do we want to reduce our emissions, reduce our greenhouse gas? And I accept that we need to do something in that regard. But at the same time, that would only transfer that production to other parts of the world. And I think we need to look at it holistically, globally, and say, what is the right thing to do?
So then if we are going to continue on with our current intensity of dairy, how do we balance making the money for both your company and New Zealand with environmental losses?
So I think we all have a role to play across New Zealand. It starts with central government, it starts with local governments, it starts with the producers such as us, but we also got to send the right signals. It's got to be backed up by science, and there's a lot of talk out there around what the right thing to do is. Let's back it up by science, because you don't want to go down a path of making significant change only to realise things may be different. So let's understand what that looks like.
There were reports in New Zealand from the OECD as far back as sort of 1984 which said, don't go down this intensive industrialised route, don't build all of these milk dryers, don't go this way. And that was science-backed, and we didn't follow the science then.
Yeah, you see that's the bit I'm not sure about. I mean, you could find a report that tells you what you want to see on any given day. I think what we do need to come together as a whole of society in New Zealand and say what it is we're trying to achieve here. So I think it's about finding the right position that we're all happy with.
For much of its history, Fonterra had ambitions to be a global giant in the dairy industry, so they opened factories and bought businesses overseas. But that didn't pan out as well as they hoped. In recent years, they had to pay $250 million over a baby formula contamination scare, and they lost nearly $1 billion from selling off failing assets overseas, which led to a $605 million net loss in 2019.
So we invested quite heavily through that period in offshore milk, and history has shown that we probably didn't execute that as best as we could have. So more recently it's decided to focus more on the goodness we produce here, focus on the value part of the equation more so than the volume. As consumption continues to grow globally, it gives you the ability to say who are the customers that are going to pay for what we do and how we do it in New Zealand, and we target those as opposed to chasing it all.
So far this change is going well for Fonterra, posting a $659 million profit in 2020. In theory, the value approach would allow us to produce less milk for more money, ideally allowing us to find a better balance between economy and environment. It could be just the thing farmers like Scott are looking for. It's a balance that young people really care about and that dairy's perceived as not being in line with. And because of this, there's fewer and fewer young people getting involved in the industry. It's not clear who the next generation of dairy farmers will even be.
The average age within dairy is definitely becoming older and older. This is something that we need to look at long term. More and more young people are not just turning vegan, but even on a lighter scale, just do not want to be associated with any dairy products. Like, this is a very large part of New Zealand's, history and culture. It's very important to maintain and to have that dialogue and not for each side to shout at each other and just become aggressive. I think it is possible to show with the direction that we're heading, if we can move in a more regenerative direction, dairy as an industry could be seen as a really attractive career.
What would be the benefits of having young people come through into the sector, do you think?
The younger generation actually bring that innovation and will bring that lens to the farming industries, helping to drive changes in business moving forward.
You've got a fourth generation of Mathiesons farming on this land. Does that make you guys quite proud to think that the land that you're working is one that, your family's worked for generations?
Well, I'm incredibly proud, Baz, but it also something of a burden too, where you want it to carry on. There is that expectation of yourself that you make sure that you actually leave a business that is robust enough that the next generation can carry on. As an industry as a whole, it will be a real challenge. The worst thing you can do as that older generation is have an expectation that these guys will carry on and do it as you did it, because they won't. I look forward to seeing what it looks like. I hope I'm here to see what it looks like in 20 years' time.
Every business has a balance sheet. On one side, you've got how much it costs to run the business. On the other side, you've got how much money you make. For decades, dairy and other industries haven't properly reflected the cost of doing business in their balance sheets because they haven't included the environmental impact. Researching this series, I discovered this interesting quirk. Whenever there's a report discussing the environmental impact of dairy, there's always this little paragraph wedged in there discussing how much money the industry makes. But then when there's a report about how much money it makes, there's never a similar paragraph about the environmental impact. That's what we're going to do with this series. Now that we've looked at the revenue column of the dairy industry, we're going to spend the rest of the series looking at what the true cost of the industry is when you take into account its impact on our water, our atmosphere, our soil, and our animals.